Hi there, I'm Ty Newton, and this is the second in my series of reviewing the hero talent trees for Preservation Evoker. I primarily play Preservation Evoker in Mythic Plus, and so most of my reviews are going to be based around that rather than the raid healing aspects. Uh, this one will be covering the Chronowarden hero talents. This one was announced a little while back, but seeing as I reviewed the Flame Shaper hero talents, I thought it apt to go back and review some of this in comparison. I've got some notes on the right hand of my screen here if you wanted to follow along. But yeah, let's dive in and have a look through some of it. So the keystone talent here, Chrono Flame, reads Living Flame is enhanced with bronze magic, repeating 15% of the damage or healing you dealt to the target in the last 5 seconds as arcane, up to a fixed amount. Now, it doesn't state what this fixed amount is, so for the most part I'm going to ignore that, but this may come into play as a balancing aspect to this hero talent. One of the notes around this is that this actually replaces Living Flame, and it does a couple of things. It helps spot healing by quite a lot. If you have some heal over times rolling on your group, or you've recently chucked out a Spirit Bloom, if someone needs topping off and you fire a Chrono Flame, which was a Living Flame, into them, then it will just give you a little bit more of a boost based on the healing that you've previously given them, which can help in quite a lot of situations. It also helps make some really good combos. So, as an example of single spot sustain, so an example of this being Etch on Waycrest Manor from the Witches, or the Drown effect in Throne of Tides. You could do something like Echo into Reversion, ideally with Grace Period, Echo into into Verdant Embrace, ideally with Ancient Flame, which speeds up your Living Flame, and then Chrono Flame. And because you've put out a lot of healing with those Echoes, Reversions, Echo, Verdant Embrace, the Chrono Flame, as well as doing the base Living Flame healing, boosted by Verdant Embrace, will also repeat 15% of the healing that you've done in that sort of previous combo. As long as it doesn't hit that fixed amount that's spoken about in this tooltip here, then that's potentially really strong at being able to push through a really dangerous damage event on a single target. You can also use it as a supplemental AoE tool. So if you do a 5 stack of a Spirit Bloom, heal a load of targets, and if you've got a Leaping Flames from a previous Fire Breath, then you can chuck that out and have 5 targets healed up with Chrono Flame, which will just boost based off that Spirit Bloom healing you do, which is a decent amount. It gives some single target damage as well. So outside of Fire Breath, when you're just effectively spamming Living Flame or Chrono Flame in this case, it will ramp up based on the damage that you've done before. So without haste, if you were just spamming Living Flame at a 2-second cast time, this would give you, after the third Living Flame, it would effectively be 40% or so empowered, because you would have 15% from each of the 2 previous at 30%, plus a little bit extra. Obviously that scales with haste, so you would get even more benefit if you are in a high haste build, which most Preservation Evokers are. So just that extra bit of single target damage is quite useful as well. So a good start to the tree, and let's go through the rest. On the left hand side we have Warp. So hover now warps you through time and space, and its cooldown is reduced by 5 seconds. Hover continues to allow evoker spells to be cast while moving. One of the notes about this is that it's going to differ, or presumably differ quite a bit in how this interacts with your character and momentum and potentially pathing. So there are cases where you can use hover at the moment and try and utilize the momentum that it gives your character to sort of clear certain objects, or keep going over a drop or something like that. If you're going down a flight of stairs, you can hover off and use that momentum to travel further, using your wings to catch you before you hit the floor. With warp, this doesn't look like it will actually change your character's momentum, so it will be more like a blink. It will blink you forward. That can be useful, but it can have a couple of niche side effects, as I mentioned, with the momentum side of things. So it could also suffer from pathing issues, similar to how blink does. There have been quite a few rocks and carpets in the past where trying to blink off of them as a mage will not send you quite as far as you expect. So we'll have to wait and see if warp suffers from the same problems that blink does in those regards. It can be quite useful though for avoiding some ground effects entirely, whereas hover would send you over that ground effect and you might take a tick of damage, or suffer the harmful effect of whatever it is. Warp should, in theory, send you completely to the other side without suffering any instances of that. Also, the reduction from 35-second cooldown to 30-second cooldown is nice, particularly if you've got a couple of charges of this with your talents. Alright, moving down the left-hand side to the second node. This is a choice node between interdimensional phase, which says warp reduces damage taken by 30%, starting high and reducing over 2 seconds, and motor acceleration, which I'll cover in a bit. So the interdimensional phase, this one, it received a little bit of an uproar when this one was released about the defensives, defensive creep in the game, and how powerful this was on potentially quite a short cooldown. It's not clear based on this how quickly it goes down is one note that I have around this. It's potentially very strong, but timing a damage event with this in Mythic Plus can be a little tricky, particularly as Preservation Evoker. Quite often with damage events as Preservation Evoker, you're trying to time and line up a strong empowered spell for when that damage event goes off, something like a Spirit Bloom. So as a big stomp or something happens, you normally want a couple of 2.5 seconds before to start casting your Spirit Bloom, so that you can get that off just as the damage event happens. If you're also trying to time a warp or your hover with that, it means you can't prep those spells. So it means that this is only really useful in cases where you are really trying to survive a one shot. You don't have any of your other defensives up. And as Preservation, if you're using your cooldowns properly, your 2 charges of Obsidian Scales, which you most of the time should be talented into, and your Renewing Blaze, and potentially even using Rescue Shields if you're talented into that on yourself and another person, you're normally not the person that's run out of defensives first. So having this extra defensive is often not going to make the biggest difference, and you're normally better placed being able to help another member of your party who's a bit squishier, by either healing them quicker, giving them time dilation, something like that, and then trying to top them off quickly. So although this is very strong, I would say it has perhaps been a little overstated, and it is very clunky to use as Preservation Evoker, to its detriment. Also, it's not clear from the tooltip how quickly this reduces, so if we assume every 1 second it reduces, it'll probably look something like 30% for the first second, after the first second it's 15%, and then 0% after 2 seconds when it expires. It may be more granular or faster than that, but we just don't know at the moment. And that timing is going to make it very dependent of how viable this talent is. I still think this is probably the one that people will choose, but I think its value is not as strong as it may originally appear to be. The other option, motes of acceleration, this reads, Warp leaves a trail of motes of acceleration. Allies who come into contact with a mote gain 20% increased movement speed for 30 seconds. This doesn't state whether when an ally comes into contact with a mote it consumes it or not. I would imagine from similar abilities in the game, Angelic Feather, that kind of thing, that it probably does consume it. One of the surprising things about this spell and tooltip is that although the 20% increased movement speed isn't a lot, the 30 seconds duration is kind of insane. I'm not really aware of any other abilities or external movement speed abilities that have that kind of duration. So that's kind of interesting. It also doesn't say how many motes are ejected from your dragon's butt, whether it's just a couple, 5, or whether you effectively have enough for a raid. Overall, I'd say this is niche at best. There are some applications potentially for it, such as if you have a paladin who's gonna in a raid immune a load of orbs spawning over an area, you could prepare ahead of time by giving them some motes of acceleration, so that over 30 seconds it's going to really help them immune as many things as possible. But for the most part, I'd say this is kind of niche. Okay, so moving further down, we have another choice node. I think this is probably one of the more interesting choice nodes that they've released on any of the trees so far. The first choice here being Careful Contemplation. Your intellect and stamina are increased by 10%, but your cooldowns are also increased by 10%. So, yeah, this one's kind of cool. One of the things that aren't obvious is the higher stamina that you get from this indirectly increases the value of your mastery. If you have higher health than the remainder of your party, you take a flat amount of damage. Theoretically, your health should be higher than than most of the party. So your mastery is going to kick into effect where it wouldn't do previously. However, the increased cooldown, it appears to be for every spell, which may or may not be the case. This could just be something that isn't covered in this tooltip. But, increasing every cooldown by 10% is a bit strange. Even things like your Lust CD or something like that. We'll have to wait and see. And although 10% is a small amount, over a period of time it can kind of mess up your cooldowns a bit if you're trying to plan stuff out. So an interesting one, and I really like it, but weighing it up against the alternative, it becomes quite interesting. So the other choice here is Time Convergence. Abilities with a 45-second or longer cooldown grant 10% intellect for 15 seconds. Defensive abilities also grant defensive abilities grant 10% stamina for 15 seconds, and essence spells extend the duration by 1 second. There's a lot to take in for this one. I've got quite a few notes on here, but at first glance it's going to be a lot harder to use for beginners. It also doesn't state on here for the intellect and stamina whether this is an either or, that pretty much all the defences, or at least all the ones I can think of, are longer than 45 seconds. So does that mean that pressing Obsidian Scales will give you 10% intellect and 10% stamina? It's not clear. The extension for this with the essence spells is a nice bonus, but I don't think it's something you're likely to play around with. If you're playing a Blossom build in Raid or something like that, then maybe so, because you're going to build up your essence bursts and your essence for a load of blossoms. And if you can time that with a CD, and you could get a bit more extension here. But if you're playing more of an echo focused build, then you're only really going to be using this on echo, which you're going to get a couple of potentially within this 15-second window, depending on your ramp or the upcoming damage events. But yeah, I don't think you're going to game this one too much. Just to give you an idea, and I'm aware that on a lot of screens this is going to be fairly small text, but I went through and collected all of the 45-second or longer CDs, and there's quite a lot here. So we've got Zephyr at 2 minutes, Emerald Communion at 3 minutes, Deep Breath at 2 minutes, and Tail Swipe at 45 seconds or 90 seconds, and Wing Buffet at 45 or 90. You've got your Oppressing Roar, Tip the Scales at 2 minutes, Stasis at 90 seconds, Rewind at 4 minutes without any talents, your Lust, Fury of the Aspects at 5 minutes, Landslides at 90 seconds, Rescue at 60 seconds, Obsidian Scales at 90, and Renewing Blaze at 60 or 90. I wouldn't be surprised if some of those aren't included in this. Things like Landslide, it says CC on a 90-second cooldown. Maybe that won't give you the 10% intellect, I don't know. But there are plenty of things there that you could theoretically use to keep this up. Even things like Wing Buffet and Tail Swipe. They're something that you use fairly commonly in a Mythic Plus environment as part of your CC chain. And the fact that that also gives you the 10% intellect is kind of nice. So the value of this one is going to depend on how many of those interact with this, whether all of them do, and also whether your defensives give you both intellect and stamina. It also depends how they class defensives as well, because you've got your Obsidian Scales and your Renewing Blaze, which I think are fairly obvious defensives, but Zephyr as a group defensive, does that count? And Emerald Communion at its base is a defensive spell that spills over to other people. Does that count or not? So yeah, a lot of question marks on this one. I think it has the highest ceiling on how you can go with it, because it doesn't increase your cooldowns. But yeah, it requires proper spell usage, and I think for the majority of people outside of cutting edge content or high keys, careful contemplation might be the better option, just for the base throughput that it gives, as well as the mastery interactions by default. Okay, moving to the center column. Temporal Burst. Tip the Scales overloads you with temporal energy, increasing your haste, movement speed, and cooldown recovery rate by 2%, ramping up to 40% over 20 seconds. Presumably this is a linear increase over that 20 seconds. Averaged out, if you were to average it over that 20 seconds, it works out 20% cooldown reduction and haste, or 4 seconds of total cooldown reduction for all your spells. Even things like your defensives and so on would benefit from this. If you had a really tight fight where you need to eke out every bit that you can of defensiveness and throughput, you could play around this quite a bit. So there's a few things to think about with this one though. So Tip the Scales, you would often use it to fill a healing event or a damage event during movement, and often after that point, depending on the fight, you don't need further throughput over the next 20 seconds. So again, if you look at something like Archmage Soul in Everbloom, you do need healing 20 seconds later. But a lot of raid encounters or other, boss fights, they won't require you to, do a big spirit bloom through, tip the scales, and then pump out a load more over the next 20 seconds. So I think the value that this gets is really going to depend on the encounter. If there is a damage event around 20 seconds later, or just less than 20 seconds later, such as Archmage Soul, you could kind of play around this a bit. So you could go tip the scales into Spirit Bloom to heal the initial event, and then from that point you could Verdant Embrace, start ramping Echoes, and then you could Dream Breath towards the end of this buff, or whenever the damage event is going to happen. So right at the end, your Dream Breath that you've got with all your Echoes and everything out, because of the haste that you get from this, it would be ticking 40% faster, or you'd be getting 40% more throughput at that point. So it could help cover things that Dream Breath wouldn't quite be able to cover on its own at the end of this. Now, theoretically, as long as no snapshotting happens at any point, this will mean that any HOTS that you get out during this time will tick faster and faster over this 20 seconds. So it's a really great bonus. It needs a bit of planning and thought about how to game around it, otherwise you just sort of get a passive CDR value. So again, it's got a very high ceiling on what it can do, but really depends on the player and the group if you can rely on a steady event happening every certain time period. Moving down, we've got Threads of Fate. Casting an Essence ability during Temporal Burst, which is what we were just talking about, this 20 seconds, causes a nearby ally to gain Threads of Fate for 15 seconds, granting them a chance to echo their damage or healing spells, dealing 15% of the amount again. This is probably going to change value a bit between Mythic Plus and Raid. If you give an ally one of these buffs in Mythic Plus and they get X% damage increase from it, it's going to be a little bit like Evoker in terms of the value that gives. It's going to be more value in M Plus because you've affected a larger proportion of your group rather than in Raid. If we sort of rewind a bit to that ramp I was talking about a minute ago with Temporal Burst, so Temporal Burst into Spirit Bloom, and then you Verdant Embrace and start ramping Echoes. When you're ramping Echoes before your Dragon's Breath, it means you're going to be chucking out loads of these Threads of Fate on. Presumably over that period you would be able to effectively give everyone in your party one of these. Now, it's not clear the chance here of how often it's going to deal that 15% damage, so that's going to need a little bit of clarification. But yeah, if you again can play Temporal Burst well into a ramp, you could really benefit from this. In a more sort of raid environment or where you're doing a Blossom build, you will still gain a benefit from it, but Blossom costs 3 essence as opposed to 2 for Echo, so you will be able to cast fewer of these with your essence that you have on your Evoker. It sort of digs a little bit more into these Threads of Fate with the choice node below. So Master of Destiny, empower spells amplify all of your active Threads of Fate, increasing their power by 100% for 8 seconds, stacking up to 2 times. Now, if you've been ramping your Threads of Fate up, then it's quite likely that some of them are going to have less than 8 seconds remaining. It has a 15-second total duration. So I imagine this doesn't extend them to the 8 seconds, it will just empower them for the remainder of their time. But that may be something that that happens that isn't clear based on this tooltip. One of the things I've got around here is that it's not often that we use double empowered healing spells, so you wouldn't often go Spirit Bloom. You wouldn't go Temporal Burst, Spirit Bloom, and then Dragon's Breath, Dream Breath, into another empowered healing, because you've already used Spirit Bloom from Tip the Scales, right? So you're more often likely to pair this with Fire Breath. So you could go Dream Breath with a Fire Breath, something like that. And that would be the only way that I could foresee that you would stack this 2 times, and even then, one of those, namely the Fire Breath, is likely to be empowered, meaning that the time of your Threads of Fate is still ticking down on everyone, so you're not going to get the full 8 seconds. But yeah, this one, I don't know, it feels a little clunky, but we have to wait and see how this one plays out, I think. This is purely group throughput and not personal. I don't know if the hooks for logs and that kind of thing are going to tie back into the Evoker. I'm sure lots of people are getting Augmentation Evoker flashbacks. But yeah, other than that, this is a purely group throughput, and you don't really gain any extra healing from this. The only time you would is if you have more than one healer in the group, and you could empower them to increase their healing and so on. But that's only really a raid concern rather than M+. The other option here, Golden Opportunity. Prescience has a 25% chance to not incur a cooldown. That's obviously for Aug, as we don't have Prescience for Preservation. But similarly, Echo has a 25% chance not to cost Essence. I tend not to like the RNG Essence costs too much, simply because it doesn't really let you plan a ramp very well. But in the case of working with Temporal Burst, where you're then wanting to spend a load of Essence to spread Threads of Fate and so on, 25% chance is a decent chance. You are likely to get 1 or maybe 2 of these per ramp in a Mythic Plus environment. So it will help you spread the Echoes and then the Threads of Fate, so that you can, get the Threads of Fate out and have more Echoes for when your Dream Breath is out towards the end, and you have all the extra haste and so on. So there's a few synergies here that aren't obvious. Again, I would prefer a little more consistency with the Echo side of things, such as, maybe even Echo has a 50% chance to only cost 1 essence or something like that. That would have strange interactions with Essence Burst, I know. So there are pros and cons here, but yeah, it's better than nothing. And I think if I were to choose between these two in a Mythic Plus environment, it's based on the proc chance of the Threads of Fate, but I'm leaning into the Golden Opportunity personally, just to allow you to get more Threads of Fate out by casting more Essence abilities, rather than empowering them as it feels like they might be dropping off. Okay, onto the right hand side, Reverberations. Spirit Bloom heals for an additional 30% over 8 seconds. This is effectively a large part of the Season 2 tier set from Dragonflight. It's very useful. It's great for throughput, but beyond that, it means that you can quite often save some CDs that you would otherwise use to top people after a Spirit Bloom if there's a debuff that's still ticking, or if you need to top people off before the next damage event, because it's a big burst of damage that will otherwise kill them. So yeah, it's a nice bonus. On to the second one. Primacy is, I'm assuming, how you pronounce this one. For each damage over time effect from Spirit Bloom, gain 3% haste up to 9%. It's quite rare as a Preservation Evoker, at least in M+, that you're, well, and Raid to be honest, that you're casting Spirit Bloom below a 3 in power. Normally you're doing this as high as you can. So you're going to have, I believe that you're going to have this up at 9% every time you cast Spirit Bloom. For 8 seconds, that is. So one of the notes for this is that this potentially gets some extra value from CDR talents. And I'm not just talking about Temporal Burst here, although that does play into it. But by default, Spirit Bloom has, I think it's a 30-second cooldown. So you're going to have 8-second healing and 9% haste for 8 seconds every 30 seconds. If you were to take Nosdormu's teachings to instead get your Temporal Anomaly to reduce your Empower spells, that would take 5 seconds off. And I forget the name of the other... there's another talent. There we go. Spiritual Clarity. So Spirit Bloom's cooldown is reduced by 10 seconds. So between both of those, you can effectively halve the cooldown of Spirit Bloom, giving you a 15-second cooldown, which will mean that for over half of the time, you will have Spirit Bloom ticking away, healing people, and an extra 9% haste, which presumably feeds back in, to your other hots and things as well. So yeah, something to consider. I personally play Nosdormu's teachings in my Mythic Plus keys for better empowered spell CD management and so on, but this may lean further into that. Yeah, so quite an interesting one. And then the final one here on the right hand side, Instability Matrix. Each time you cast an Empower spell, Unstable Time Magic reduces its cooldown by up to 15 seconds. So you can kind of see where this is going, right? I assume this is going to be a chance linearly between 1 second and 15 seconds cooldown reduction. It's not going to work like this in practice, but you can average this at 7.5 seconds CDR. If you do take the other CDR talents like Clarity and Nosdormu's teachings, then potentially your Spirit Bloom is going to be up a hell of a lot at the time. This could cause some mana issues, but yeah, this will feed in quite nicely to some of the other talents on this hero track. The randomness of this makes it a little hard to plan damage events. So you need to be careful. I think not going, oh great, I got a massive CDR on this spell, I'm just going to chuck it out and get the throughput out, and then messing up your plan and leaving yourself dry of anything for the next damage event, when you'd planned to save whatever was coming up. So yeah, it potentially could be a bit of a bait in some cases, but overall any CDR reduction is great, and it's really going to feed back into some of these other abilities, as long as it allows you to plan your combos well enough. I mentioned in my other video for the Flame Shaper that I see Preservation Evoker as much more of a combo healer than anything else. You quite often want to use spells in a certain order to fulfill the healing for a damage event, leaving yourself with certain other things for the next one, and so on. So yeah, you just need to make sure that this one doesn't mess you up. Okay, finally we have After Image as the capstone. Empower spells send up to 3 Chrono Flames to your targets, Chrono Flames have a small chance to grant you Essence Burst. So the Season 3 Dragonflight tier set has something very similar to this, where it sends 3 Living Flames. The 4 piece also gives you Echo chance based on those, or any Living Flames that go out, which this does not do. So this is sort of half of the tier set. But obviously Chrono Flames has extra benefits around repeating 15% of the healing that you dealt to the target, or damage if this is used offensively, and so on. So this is nice. If you use this, so let's say you have a Spirit Bloom, which we've spoken about a lot on the right hand side here. If you do a big old Spirit Bloom, it's going to do a lot of healing. It's going to put a hot on the target afterwards. Potentially it can be available very often, but it will also send out 3 Chrono Flames that will heal your normal Living Flame amount, plus an extra chunk of the damage of the healing that you just healed with Spirit Bloom, because of the 15% repeating and so on. So yeah, it's great for turning Spirit Bloom into even more of a bursty heal, which perhaps it doesn't need, but hey, extra throughput is extra throughput, until Blizzard change how healing happens and makes it far more of a gradual up and down. The burst is sometimes all that's going to work for us. So yeah, this will be powerful. Overall, I would say this Chronowarden tree really does lean into the Echo build quite a bit, and although it can be used with a Blossom build for raid and so on, it feels slightly less efficient perhaps. There's a lot of synergies in here, and some of it is going to require us playing with this and seeing quite how it works, and spells that interact and don't interact, before we can say how powerful it is. I would not be surprised to see some changes to this, because it feels, at least from the tooltips, very powerful compared to some of the others. And although Flame Shaper I think has the potential to be powerful, just from initial impressions this one does feel stronger, at least from an M+ perspective, where you can really build those combos and plan out for particular boss fights on Tyrannical and so on. So yeah, let me know your thoughts, what you thought of my review here, what you think of the tree altogether, and if there's anything else that you'd like me to go through. If you guys like videos like this, let me know and I'll look to do more. Have a great time. Cheers.